From Naya Rivera, who saved her young son before disappearing beneath the water, to Matthew Perry, whose sudden loss stunned generations of sitcom fans, to Alan Rickman, whose unforgettable screen presence left a void in Hollywood. We remember the stars whose deaths shook the entertainment world. Keep watching, because one screenwriter's death was hidden by a major studio to protect a billion-dollar franchise. He was 27 years old. He had 3 Star Trek films behind him, and he was killed in his own driveway by his own car. Anton Yelchin died on June 19, 2016, and the way it happened is the reason he belongs at the very front of this list. This was not an overdose, not a long illness, not a slow decline the public could see coming. This was a freak mechanical accident that took less than 2 minutes, and it happened to a young actor whom friends and directors believed was about to become one of the biggest names of his generation. Yelchin fit the title perfectly because his death was loud for about a week, and then almost completely vanished from public conversation. He played Pavel Chekhov in the rebooted Star Trek films, the navigator with the thick Russian accent and the boyish grin. When he died, the cast mourned, the fans mourned, and then the franchise kept moving and the headlines moved with it. A healthy young man standing in his own driveway, killed by a parked vehicle that should have been sitting still, is the kind of detail that turns a forgotten death into a story worth retelling. Yelchin was born in Leningrad in the Soviet Union in 1989, and his parents were professional figure skaters who left for the United States when he was a baby. He grew up in California, started acting as a child, and by his early 20s, had built a reputation as a serious young performer who chose interesting projects instead of easy paychecks. His filmography was broader than most casual fans realized. He starred in Alpha Dog, Like Crazy, and the cult horror film Green Room, and he worked with respected directors who praised his instincts and his work ethic. He was an actor's actor, the kind of performer other actors quietly admired and wanted to work alongside. That quiet respect is part of why his death faded the way it did. He was beloved inside the industry, but he was never the kind of celebrity whose face sold magazines at the grocery store checkout. When a character actor of his type dies young, the grief is real but concentrated, and concentrated grief is exactly the kind the wider public eventually forgets. The accident happened at his home in the Studio City neighborhood of Los Angeles. Yelchin had gotten out of his 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee, and the vehicle rolled backward down his steep driveway while he was behind it. The car pinned him against a brick mailbox pillar and a security fence, trapping him in a position from which he could not escape. The official cause of death was blunt, traumatic asphyxia. In plain terms, the weight and position of the vehicle crushed him in a way that made it impossible to breathe. The medical examiner concluded that he died in roughly 1 minute, which means there was almost no window in which anyone could have saved him, even if they had been standing right there. He was found by friends who had arranged to meet him that night. When he did not show up and did not answer, they came to his house and discovered him trapped in the driveway. By the time they reached him, it was already too late, and what should have been an ordinary evening had become the scene of one of the strangest celebrity deaths of the decade. The reason the car rolled is where the story becomes more than just a tragic accident. The 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee used an electronic gear shifter that did not work like a traditional one. Instead of a lever that locked into a clear physical position for park, it used a monostable shifter that returned to the same center position regardless of the gear selected, which made it easy for drivers to believe they were in park when they were actually in neutral. This design had already generated complaints before Yelchin's death. Drivers reported their vehicles rolling away after they thought they had parked, and the confusion was common enough that regulators had taken notice. The shifter looked sleek and modern, but it removed the simple physical feedback that had told drivers for generations exactly what gear they were in. In the months before the accident, the vehicle had actually been part of a recall connected to exactly this problem. Fiat Chrysler had recalled more than 1 million vehicles over the rollaway risk, and Yelchin's Jeep was among the models affected. The recall existed, but the fix had not yet reached his car, which is the kind of timing detail that makes the whole thing feel even more cruel. His parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the automaker, arguing that the defective gear selector was responsible for their son's death. The lawsuit was settled in 2018, closing the legal chapter of a story the public had largely stopped paying attention to by then. And to understand why his death hit so hard, you have to understand where his career was heading. Yelchin was not a fading star clinging to past glory. He was on an upward path, earning reviews that suggested his best work was still ahead of him. And when someone dies in a freak accident at the peak of an upward climb, there is no narrative, only a sudden blank space where a career should have been. His final film roles were released after his death, which created the strange experience of watching new performances from an actor who was already gone. He had completed work on Star Trek Beyond, which came out about a month after he died, and the studio chose not to recast Chekhov out of respect for him. That decision meant his character was effectively retired alongside him, a quiet acknowledgement that no one else should step into a role he had made his own. For fans of the franchise, every rewatch of those films now carries an extra weight because the navigator on the bridge is played by someone who never got to grow old. The films themselves became unintentional memorials. A blockbuster meant purely as entertainment turned into a record of a life cut short, preserved frame by frame. Long after the headlines disappeared, his performances remained, which is the strange immortality that screen actors get even when the world forgets the circumstances of their death. The wider context of 2016 also played a role in why Yelchin slipped from memory so quickly. That year became infamous as a brutal stretch for celebrity deaths, with a long string of icons dying within months of one another. David Bowie, Prince, Muhammad Ali, and Gene Wilder all died in 2016, among many others, and a 27-year-old character actor was always going to struggle to hold the spotlight against names of that magnitude. Grief is not infinite, and attention is not evenly distributed. The same year that should have made every individual loss feel more precious instead turned them into a blur. And Yelchin became one of many names in a year people mostly remember as simply cursed. His parents later established a foundation in his name to support young artists and to raise awareness about cystic fibrosis, a condition he had lived with privately his entire life without ever using it for publicity. What makes Yelchin the right opening for this list is the pure shock value of the facts when stated plainly. A rising star, 27 years old, killed in under a minute by his own parked car because of a shifter design regulators had already flagged as dangerous. His death was sudden, it was preventable, it sparked a brief important conversation, and then it faded almost completely from public memory, while the franchise he helped carry rolled on without him. But Yelchin's story, as strange as it is only the beginning, because the next person on this list also died in a sudden accident involving water and a desperate fight for survival. The difference is that she died not trying to save herself, but trying to save the one person she loved most in the world. She drowned in a lake while her 4-year-old son sat safely on the boat because she used the last of her strength to push him to safety instead of saving herself. Naya Rivera died on July 8, 2020 at the age of 33, and the details of her final minutes turned a tragic accident into one of the most heartbreaking stories of the decade. She belongs here because the world wept for a week, and then a pandemic and an avalanche of news swallowed her story whole. Rivera fit the title because her fame was tied to a show that had already ended its cultural run by the time she died. She was best known as Santana Lopez on the musical series Glee, a role that made her a star to a specific generation. But Glee had been off the air for years, and the show itself had become shadowed by a string of tragedies among its cast. The circumstances of her death are what make it linger for anyone who learns them. This was not a random accident with no meaning behind it. This was a mother making a choice in her final moments, and the evidence investigators gathered painted a picture of sacrifice, so complete that it is difficult to discuss without pausing. Rivera was born in California in 1987 and started performing as a young child, appearing in commercials and television before she was even old enough for school. She was a working actress almost her entire life, building experience role by role, until Glee made her a household name in the early 2010s. On the show, she played a cheerleader whose character arc became one of its most celebrated, a storyline about identity and self-acceptance that resonated deeply with a generation of young viewers. Her performance as Santana made her a fan favorite, and she also pursued music, showcasing the singing voice that the show had put on display every week. By 2020, she had transitioned into life as a mother, raising her young son Shozi. The frantic pace of Glee was behind her, and she was in a quieter chapter of her life, the kind of stretch where a former star slips a little further from the headlines with each passing year. That quiet is part of why her death, when it came, surprised so many people who had not thought about her in a while. On July 8, 2020, Rivera rented a pontoon boat and took Josie out onto Lake Piru, a reservoir in Ventura County, California. It was meant to be an ordinary afternoon, a mother and her son spending time on the water during a difficult summer. There was nothing about the day that suggested it would end in tragedy. At some point, the two of them got into the water to swim. The lake is known for strong currents and unpredictable conditions beneath a calm-looking surface, factors that would prove fatal. While they were in the water, the boat began to drift, and the situation turned from a swim into a desperate fight to get back to safety. What happened next was reconstructed by investigators afterward because there were no other witnesses. The only survivor of those final minutes was a 4-year-old child, and so the official account had to be built from his statements, from the physical evidence, and from the autopsy. The picture that emerged was one of a mother who got her son to safety and could not save herself. According to the account pieced together, Rivera managed to get Josie back onto the drifting boat. She was able to get her son onto the deck, but she could not get herself aboard. Pushing a child up and out of the water takes enormous effort, and doing it while treading water in a current that is pulling you away is the kind of effort that drains a swimmer completely. The boy later told investigators that his mother boosted him up onto the boat and then put her arm up in the air. She called out for help and then disappeared beneath the surface. That single raised arm became the defining image of the whole tragedy, a final gesture from a woman who had spent her last reserves saving her child. The detail that breaks people is that Josie was found safe. When searchers reached the drifting boat, the 4-year-old was on board asleep wearing a life jacket. His mother had made sure he had a life jacket on. She had given him every protection she could before she went under, and she had not had one herself. Break. The search for Rivera lasted several days and became a national story while it was happening. The autopsy concluded that the cause of death was accidental drowning, with no drugs or alcohol involved, making clear that this was simply exhaustion and current overcoming a swimmer who had given everything to save her child. The eeriest detail surfaced after her death when fans looked at her social media. Her last post had been a photo of herself with her son, captioned simply with the words, "Just the two of us." Posted shortly before the boat trip. It read in hindsight like an unintentional farewell, a final image of the bond that defined her last act. Break. The reason Rivera's death faded so quickly comes down almost entirely to when it happened. July of 2020 was a moment when the entire world was consumed by a single overwhelming story. A global pandemic dominated every news cycle, every conversation, every screen, and there was very little room for anything else to hold attention. Under normal circumstances, the death of a young mother who drowned saving her child would have stayed in the public conversation for a long time. The story had everything that usually keeps a tragedy alive: a heartbreaking arc, a sympathetic figure, a child survivor. But it landed in a year when collective attention was stretched thinner than it had ever been. So the world grieved briefly and then was pulled back into the larger crisis surrounding it. For the generation that grew up on Glee, though her death never really faded, because the show had been a formative experience, and her character, in particular, had meant something to people. Navigating questions about their own identities, what sets Rivera apart on this list is the clarity of the sacrifice. Hers was tragic because in her final moments she made a deliberate choice, and that choice cost her everything and saved the one person it was meant to save. People do not just feel sorry when they hear it, they feel something closer to awe at what a parent will do. But not every death on this list carries that kind of clear, redemptive meaning. The next person was even younger than Rivera, a star barely out of his teens, and he died not in a dramatic accident, but quietly in his sleep, from a condition his own family had never even heard of until it killed him. He was 20 years old, a healthy and rising Disney star, and he died in his sleep from a condition most people, including his own family, had never heard of. Cameron Boyce died on July 6, 2019, and the cause of his death turned a private family tragedy into a public education about a hidden risk. He belongs on this list because his death stunned a generation of young fans, and then slipped away as those fans grew up and the news cycle moved on. Boyce fit the title because his fame was concentrated almost entirely among young viewers. He was a star to children and teenagers who watched the Disney Channel, an audience that adored him intensely, but that does not drive the kind of ongoing adult news coverage that keeps a name alive for years. When that audience aged out, much of the active memory of him aged out with it. The specific way he died is what makes his story matter beyond the grief of his fans. He did not die from an accident or an overdose, or anything that fit a familiar pattern. He died from something so under-discussed that learning about it became, for many people, the first time they had ever encountered the term at all. Break. Boyce was born in California in 1999 and started performing young, working in commercials and small roles before landing the parts that made him famous. He had a natural charisma and a gift for dance, and he became one of the recognizable faces of the Disney Channel during the 2010s, a period when the network minted teen stars at a steady pace. His biggest roles came on the series Jessie and in the Descendants film series, franchises that were enormously popular with younger audiences. He also appeared in films like Grown Ups alongside major comedy stars, showing range beyond the Disney bubble and suggesting a career that could grow well past his teen star beginnings. By his late teens, he was widely seen as one of the more talented and grounded performers of his Disney generation, someone who used his platform for charitable work and who seemed poised to make the difficult jump from child star to adult actor. He had the talent and the reputation to do it, which made what happened next feel especially unfair. Brick. On July 6, 2019, Boyce was found unresponsive at his home. There had been no warning, no dramatic incident, no sign that anything was wrong. He had simply gone to sleep and did not wake up, and the suddenness of it left everyone who knew him searching for an explanation that initially did not exist. The medical examiner's investigation eventually determined the cause. Boyce had died from sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, a condition known by the acronym SUB-EP, which occurs when a person with epilepsy dies suddenly with no other clear cause. The finding revealed something his fans had not known, that Boyce had been living with epilepsy. The detail that turned this from a private tragedy into a public lesson was how unknown the condition was. His family said they had not heard of SUB-EP before his death, even though they had known about his epilepsy. The risk existed, but no one had told them it existed, and that gap is exactly what they would later try to close. Brick. SUB-EP is rare, but it is real, and the circumstances of Boyce's death match the pattern that doctors associate with the highest risk. It is more likely to occur in people who have seizures during sleep, and Boyce died in his sleep. The condition takes the lives of a small percentage of people with epilepsy each year, but a small percentage of a large population is still a significant number of lives. What makes it so frightening is precisely that it is so quiet. There is no dramatic event for bystanders to witness, no chance for anyone to intervene, because it happens during sleep and is often discovered only the next morning. Boyce's death became almost overnight, one of the most prominent examples of SUB-EP that the general public had ever encountered. A young, famous, beloved star had died from it, and that fame forced the condition into headlines and conversations it had never reached before, doing more to publicize the risk than years of quiet medical advocacy had managed. Brick. His family channeled their grief into making sure other families would not be caught off guard the way they had been. They became advocates for epilepsy awareness and for educating people about SUB-EP specifically, working to ensure that families with epileptic members would at least be told that the risk existed. Their argument was simple and devastating. No one had sat them down and explained that a person with epilepsy who has seizures during sleep faces an elevated risk of dying in their sleep. Whether or not that knowledge could have changed the outcome, they believed families deserved to have it. This advocacy gave Boyce's death a purpose beyond the loss itself. A foundation established in his name carried forward both his charitable interests and the epilepsy awareness mission, turning the tragedy into a tool that could potentially save lives. Most forgotten celebrity deaths leave behind nostalgia and little else. Boyce's death left behind actual knowledge, a term that thousands of families now recognize, because a famous young man died from it and his family refused to stay silent. There is a strong argument that his death, as tragic as it was, prevented others by forcing awareness of SUB into the open. What makes Boyce a deliberate change of pace on this list is how different his death is from the two before it. Yelkin and Rivera died in sudden, violent physical accidents, the kind with a clear external cause. Boyce died silently, internally, from a condition no one could see. From here, the list pivots again, toward an icon whose death became one of the most legally complicated celebrity stories. In recent memory, a beloved TV actor whose death turned into a criminal case with multiple defendants. He was Chandler Bing, one of the most recognizable TV characters ever created, and his death turned into a criminal investigation that put doctors and a dealer behind a federal case. Matthew Perry died on October 28, 2023, at the age of 54. And what began as a story about addiction became a story about accountability, exploitation, and the dangerous edges of mental health treatment. He earns his place here because the headlines were enormous, and then the specifics blurred into a vague memory of the Friends actor who died. Perry fits the title in a particular way. He is not forgotten as a person because Friends reruns play constantly, and Chandler is woven into the fabric of pop culture. But the actual details of how he died, and the extraordinary criminal case that followed, are exactly the kind of thing the public absorbed for a moment and then let slip. People remember that he died. Most could not tell you how. His story is the most legally intricate on this list. This was not a simple overdose. It was a death that exposed a network of people who, according to prosecutors, profited from a vulnerable man's struggles, and the unraveling of that network is a story in itself. Breek. Perry's battle with addiction was not a secret. He had been remarkably open about it for years, and shortly before his death, he had published a memoir that laid out the full brutal arc of his struggles with alcohol and drugs. The book, titled Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing, was unsparing about how close his addictions had come to killing him many times over. In that memoir, he described a life that, behind the easy charm of his most famous character, had been a near-constant fight for survival. He detailed hospitalizations, relapses, and the staggering physical toll the years of substance abuse had taken on his body. He wrote about it not to glamorize it, but to be honest about how devastating it had been. That openness made him a sympathetic figure to people who had faced their own struggles. He had used the most famous platform imaginable to be candid about something most celebrities hide. So when he died, the initial assumption many people made was that addiction had finally won, a sad but somehow expected ending to a story he had told the world himself. Breek, the reality, as the investigation revealed, was more complicated and more disturbing. Perry had actually been doing better in some respects. He had been receiving ketamine infusion therapy, a legitimate treatment used for depression and anxiety, administered under medical supervision. Ketamine therapy is real medicine, used carefully for conditions that resist other treatments. But the ketamine in his system at the time of his death was at a level far higher than what his scheduled medical infusions could explain. His last known supervised treatment had been more than a week before he died, and ketamine does not stay in the body that long at the levels found in his autopsy. That gap meant the drug that killed him had come from somewhere other than his legitimate care. The medical examiner determined that the acute effects of ketamine were the primary cause of death, with contributing factors that included drowning and coronary artery disease. He was found unresponsive in the heated water of his home, and the combination of the drug's effects and the water proved fatal. The treatment meant to help him had become, through an outside supply, the thing that ended him. Breek. The investigation into where that extra ketamine came from is what elevated this from a tragic death to a criminal case. Federal investigators traced the supply and built a case against multiple people who, they alleged, had worked together to feed Perry's demand for the drug outside of any legitimate medical channel. Knowing how dangerous it was, 5 people were eventually charged in connection with his death. And the list of defendants was shocking in its makeup. It included 2 doctors who, as physicians, were supposed to protect patients rather than exploit them. It included people in his own circle. The case suggested that Perry had been surrounded in his vulnerability by people willing to profit from his addiction. One of the most damning details involved messages allegedly sent among the defendants. Prosecutors said that one of the doctors had written a message wondering how much a wealthy, desperate man would be willing to pay for the drug, language that reduced a struggling human being to a revenue source. That single alleged message captured the cold calculation prosecutors were describing. Breek. The case also named a person who had been close to Perry and who, according to prosecutors, had personally administered doses of the drug to him in the period leading up to his death. The intimacy of that betrayal, someone trusted being part of the chain that killed him, gave the case an emotional weight beyond the usual drug prosecution. As the cases moved through the legal system, several of the defendants entered guilty pleas, acknowledging their roles. But for the public, this was exactly the kind of follow-up that tends to vanish from memory. The initial death was huge news, the charges were big news, but the slow grind of guilty pleas and sentencing happened over many months, and most people simply did not track it. The outrage of the moment faded before the case even concluded. Breek. Perry's death sparked an important and uncomfortable conversation about ketamine therapy itself. The treatment is legitimate and has helped people for whom nothing else worked. But his death showed how a powerful drug, once introduced into a person's life through proper channels, could create a demand that bad actors were willing to exploit illegitimately. The cruelest irony is the timing relative to his own recovery narrative. He had written a memoir that was in part about survival, about having come through the worst of his addiction and wanting to help others do the same. To die when he did from a drug introduced as treatment and amplified by an exploitative supply chain undercut that hopeful arc in a way that was genuinely tragic. Break. What makes Perry essential to this list is the gap between how famous he remains and how forgotten the truth of his death is. Chandler Bing is immortal, but the man who played him died in a way that involved doctors, a federal case, guilty pleas, and a damning conversation about exploitation, and almost none of that lives in the public memory the way the character does. Fame does not protect the facts of a death from fading. Friends will play forever. And the specific, shocking, legally complex story of how Matthew Perry actually died will keep slipping further into the archive. The next person on this list also died from a private struggle, but one he chose to keep almost entirely hidden, even from the world that loved him. Where Perry told everyone about his pain, this man told almost no one, facing a brutal diagnosis in near-total secrecy and continuing to work as one of the most beloved actors of his era, right up until the world learned all at once that he had been quietly dying the whole time. He played some of the most memorable villains in film history, and he faced his own death the way his characters never would have, in near-total silence, telling almost no one. Alan Rickman died on January 14, 2016 at the age of 69, and the privacy with which he handled his illness meant that for most of the world, the news arrived as a complete shock. He belongs on this list because his death was one of the opening blows of the brutal year of 2016, and it was quickly buried beneath the avalanche of losses that followed. Rickman fits the title in a way the younger stars do not. He is not forgotten as an actor, because his performances are embedded in films people watch endlessly. But the man behind those performances, and the dignified, private way he met his end, faded fast, overshadowed within months by a relentless string of higher volume celebrity deaths. That turned 2016 into a kind of collective trauma. His story is one of contrast between the menace he projected on screen and the quiet courage he showed off it, and understanding that contrast is the key to understanding why his death resonated so deeply with the people who took the time to absorb it. Break. Rickman came to acting relatively late by industry standards, having first trained and worked as a graphic designer before committing fully to the stage. He built his reputation in British theater, developing the precise, deliberate delivery, and the unmistakable voice that would later become his signature. He was a craftsman, shaped by years of disciplined stage work before film ever found him. His breakthrough on the world stage came when he played Hans Gruber, the urbane and ruthless villain in Die Hard. It was his first major film role, and he turned what could have been a generic bad guy into one of the most beloved screen villains of all time. Intelligent, sardonic, and impossibly cool. That performance set the template for a career built on playing characters who were smarter and more interesting than the heroes opposing them. From there, he became a fixture in major films, but for an entire generation, his defining role was Severus Snape in the Harry Potter series. Across 8 films, he embodied a character whose true nature was hidden until the very end, and his restrained, layered performance became the emotional spine of the whole saga. To millions of young viewers, he was Snape, a constant presence throughout their childhoods. Break. Beyond the villains, Rickman had a warmth and a range that his fans treasured. He appeared in beloved films like Love Actually and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and Sense and Sensibility, showing that the man who played such memorable antagonists could also be tender, funny, and deeply human. He was never typecast in the way a lesser actor might have been. The people who worked with him spoke consistently of his kindness and generosity, a sharp contrast to the cold characters he so often played. He mentored younger actors, supported the theater, and was known within the industry as a genuinely good man. The menace was entirely a creation of his craft, and those who knew him understood that the real Rickman was nothing like the figures he portrayed. This dual reputation, fearsome on screen and beloved off it, made his death land harder for those who appreciated the full picture. People were not just mourning a great actor. They were mourning a person whom the industry held in real affection, whose presence had been a steady, reassuring constant across decades of cinema. Break. The illness that killed him was pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and deadly forms of the disease. According to accounts that emerged later, The cancer was discovered after he suffered a minor stroke in the summer before his death, and the diagnosis that followed was devastating in its implications. Pancreatic cancer is often found late and moves quickly. What set Rickman apart was his decision to keep the diagnosis almost entirely private. He told only a small circle of those closest to him, choosing not to make his illness public, and not to turn his final months into a public farewell. He continued to live and, where he could, to work, without the world knowing that he was facing the end. This was entirely in character for a man known for his privacy and his dignity. He had never been a celebrity who courted attention or shared his personal life, and he met his death the same way he had lived, on his own terms, shielding those he loved from a prolonged public ordeal. The choice meant that his death, when announced, struck the public as sudden, even though it had not been sudden for him at all. Bleak. Because so few people knew, the news of his death hit with the force of something completely unexpected. One day he was simply Alan Rickman, the beloved actor, and the next he was gone, with the public never having had the chance to brace for it. The tributes poured in immediately, full of shock as much as grief. His Harry Potter co-stars and collaborators spoke movingly about him, and their words revealed how much affection he had inspired in the people who shared sets with him over the years. The grief was genuine and widespread, a recognition that a singular talent and a genuinely kind man had been lost. For a few days, his death was one of the biggest stories in the world. But 2016 was already in motion as a year of relentless loss. Just days before Rickman died, the music world had been shaken by another major death, and the months that followed would bring a punishing series of further losses. Rickman's death became one entry in a grim ledger that grew so long that no single name could hold the spotlight for long. Bleak. That crowding is the central reason his death faded from active memory faster than it should have. In a normal year, the death of an actor of his stature would have dominated the conversation for an extended period. In 2016, it was one wave and a flood, and the flood did not stop to let any single wave be fully felt. The idea that the year was somehow cursed became a cultural touchstone in itself, and that framing flattened the individual losses. Rickman became absorbed into that larger narrative, a name people recite when discussing that terrible year, rather than a death that gets its own sustained attention. Break. In the years since, the people closest to him have worked to keep his memory specific. His widow, Rima Horton, his partner for decades, has spoken publicly about his illness and about pancreatic cancer more broadly, and around the 10th anniversary of his death, she shared reflections about the symptoms and the realities of the disease, part of an ongoing effort to ensure his loss might help others recognize the warning signs earlier. What makes Rickman's place on this list meaningful is the lesson in how privacy and timing shape memory, mourned intensely, and then quietly filed away as the world hurried on. Break. Payne rose to fame as a teenager through a televised singing competition, where he and 4 other young men were grouped together to form what would become One Direction. The group did not win the competition, but they were assembled from individual contestants, and what followed was a level of success that almost no manufactured group has ever matched. One Direction became a global phenomenon, selling out stadiums, topping charts around the world, and inspiring a devotion among their fans that bordered on the religious. For several years, they were arguably the biggest act in popular music, and the 5 members became some of the most recognizable young men on the planet. Payne was a core part of that machine, one of the voices and faces that defined an era of pop. The intensity of that fame is difficult to overstate. These were young men who could not walk down a street without causing a commotion, whose every move was documented, whose fans numbered in the millions across every continent. Growing up inside that pressure, with the whole world watching every step, is its own kind of strange and difficult life, and it shaped everything that came after. Break. When the group went on hiatus, the members pursued solo careers, with varying degrees of success, and Payne launched his own music with some hits and high-profile appearances. But the transition from being part of an all-conquering group to standing alone is notoriously hard, and the years after One Direction were, for Payne, a more complicated chapter than the soaring early fame had been. He was candid at times about struggles with mental health and substance use, speaking about the pressures of having been famous so young, and the difficulty of finding his footing afterward. The very fame that had defined his life had also, by his own accounts, taken a real toll, and he was navigating the aftermath in a way that was not always easy or stable. This context matters because it frames the circumstances of his death. He was a young man who had lived through an extraordinary and disorienting kind of celebrity, who had spoken about his struggles, and who was, at the time of his death, in a vulnerable place that the eventual investigation would make painfully clear. Break. On October 16, 2024, Payne died after falling from a third-floor balcony at a hotel in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He had been staying at the hotel, and the fall was fatal given the height and the way he landed. The news broke quickly and spread across the world within hours, triggering an immediate outpouring of shock and grief from fans everywhere. The investigation that followed examined the circumstances around the fall, including his condition at the time. The findings indicated that substances were present in his system, painting a picture of a man who had been in a troubled state in his final hours. The details were grim, and they complicated the simple narrative of a tragic accident. Authorities in Argentina pursued the matter seriously, looking into the people and circumstances around Payne in the period leading up to his death, examining whether anyone bore responsibility for his condition or for what happened. The legal process that unfolded was a reminder that a death like this is rarely as simple as a single moment of misfortune. Break. The reaction among One Direction's fan base was overwhelming. For a generation that had grown up with the group, Payne's death was a profound shock, the loss of someone who had been a fixture of their adolescence. The surviving members released statements of grief, and fans around the world held vigils and tributes. And yet, even with all that devotion, the public conversation around Payne's death moved on with startling speed. The initial wave was enormous, but the sustained attention that such a young and famous death might seem to warrant did not fully materialize in the broader culture. The mourning was deep, but, in the wider public, surprisingly brief. Break. Part of why his death faded so fast may be the very discomfort of its circumstances. A young star falling from a balcony with substances involved is a story that is painful to dwell on, that resists the kind of clean, redemptive narrative that keeps some deaths in circulation. There was no heroic act, no quiet dignity, no clear lesson, just a young man lost in troubling and sad circumstances. The stories on this list that endure tend to have a hook the public can hold on to. A sacrifice, a mystery, an act of awareness. Payne's death was simply tragic, complicated, and uncomfortable, and those qualities do not lend themselves to the kind of repeated retelling that keeps a memory alive. The legacy of One Direction complicates the question of how forgotten Payne really is. The group's music remains beloved, which keeps his name and image in circulation in a way a solo artist might not. But being remembered as 1/5 of a group is different from being remembered as an individual, and he risks becoming a footnote in the story of the band rather than a remembered figure in his own right. Break. His story is a warning embedded in the list itself. What makes Payne essential here is how recent his death is and how quickly it still faded. The earlier entries faded over years, but Payne's is fading in real time, which suggests that the pace of forgetting is accelerating. The same cycle that erased older deaths is now working faster, and the young, the famous, and the mourned are not exempt from it. The investigation into his death continued to develop after the initial shock, with authorities examining the conduct of those around him and pursuing the question of accountability. This pattern, the explosive initial death followed by a long, quiet legal aftermath that few people track, is one of the recurring shapes of a forgotten death. The next person on this list also died recently, in 2025, and her death carried an element that Payne's did not, a genuine sense of mystery. She was found unresponsive with no immediate explanation, and the uncertainty around what had happened to her gave her death a haunting quality that lingered even as the broader public, true to form, soon turned its attention elsewhere. She had been a familiar face on television since childhood, a presence across 2 beloved cult series, and she was found unresponsive in her own apartment with no immediate explanation. Michelle Trachtenberg died on February 26, 2025, at the age of 39, and the initial mystery around her death gave it a haunting quality. She belongs on this list because she was someone a whole generation had grown up watching, and yet her death, recent as it is, has already begun to fade into the background. Trachtenberg fits the title in a particular way. She was not a tabloid superstar, but she was deeply familiar, the kind of actor whose face you recognized instantly, even if you could not immediately place every role. That familiarity made her death sad in an intimate way for the people who had watched her, and yet that same mid-level fame is exactly the kind that the broader public lets slip quickly. Her story carries a specific kind of unease, the discomfort of a young death, that arrived without a clear, immediate cause. In the first hours and days, no one could fully explain what had happened, and that uncertainty gave her passing a weight that lingered. Breek. Trachtenberg began acting as a very young child, appearing in commercials and television before most children have started school. She was a genuine child star, putting in years of work on screen, long before her teenage roles made her widely known. By the time many viewers first noticed her, she was already a seasoned performer with a substantial body of work behind her. Her early film roles included parts in family movies like Harriet the Spy and Inspector Gadget, which made her a recognizable face to children of the era. She had the kind of screen presence that made her memorable in these roles, a sharpness and a confidence unusual in a young performer. And these early parts laid the foundation for the cult fame that followed. The transition from child actor to teenage and adult roles is one that breaks many careers, but Trachtenberg navigated it, moving into the roles that would define her for her most devoted fans. She was that rare child star who kept working steadily into adulthood, accumulating a filmography that spanned different generations of audiences, who each knew her from a different phase of her career. Breek. Her most iconic role for a particular kind of fan was Dawn Summers on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where she joined the cast of one of the most beloved cult television series of its time. Buffy commanded an intensely devoted following, and becoming a significant part of that world cemented her place in the hearts of its fans for life. She later took on another role that made her a fixture of a different cultural moment, playing Georgina Sparks on Gossip Girl, a scheming, magnetic character who became a fan favorite on a series that defined a certain era of television. To be a key part of even one cult show is enough to be remembered forever by its fans. To be part of two placed her at the intersection of multiple devoted communities, all of whom felt her loss personally. In the way that has defined so much of this list, Breek. What makes Trachtenberg's inclusion meaningful is the element of mystery that set her death apart, and the speed with which even that mystery faded. A young, familiar actress found unresponsive with no immediate explanation is the kind of story that should hold attention, and for a moment it did, before the relentless cycle moved on as it always does. Her story rounds out the list's most recent deaths, the ones that prove the forgetting is accelerating, and it does so with an added layer of unease that lingers in a way the others do not. From here, the list reaches back toward an icon of a completely different kind, a music legend whose death came on a day that should have made it unforgettable. The next person sold more than 100 million records, defined an era of pop, and died on Christmas Day. And even that extraordinary timing could not keep his death from eventually fading from the front of the world's mind. He sold more than 100 million records, defined an era of pop and soul, and died on Christmas Day, and somehow even that haunting timing could not keep his death at the front of public memory. George Michael died on December 25, 2016, at the age of 53, capping the brutal year of celebrity loss with one final blow. He belongs on this list because, for an artist of his enormous stature, the specifics of his death and the depth of his story have faded in a way that seems almost impossible given how famous he was. George Michael fits the title in the most surprising way of anyone here. He was a genuine global superstar, one of the best-selling music artists of all time. And yet ask people about his death, and many will only vaguely recall that he died around Christmas. The man was a titan, and the circumstances of his passing have slipped into the kind of obscurity usually reserved for far lesser names. Behind the hits and the fame was a more complex and more admirable figure than the public image suggested, and the gap between how famous he was and how little of his real story is remembered makes him a perfect entry. Breek. George Michael first became famous as one half of the pop duo Wham, alongside his friend Andrew Ridgeley, creating bright, irresistible pop that dominated the charts in the 1980s. Wham produced some of the most enduring pop singles of the decade, and the duo became enormous stars, particularly among young audiences who embraced their energetic, joyful sound. But it became clear that George Michael was something more than a pop idol, a serious songwriter and singer with ambitions far beyond the bubblegum image of his early fame. When he launched his solo career, he revealed the full depth of his talent, moving into more mature, soulful territory and establishing himself as one of the most gifted artists of his generation. His solo work produced massive hits and showcased a voice and a songwriting ability that placed him among the elite. Songs like Careless Whisper, Faith, and Freedom became defining tracks of their era, and his albums sold in staggering numbers. With more than 100 million records sold worldwide, he ranks among the best-selling musicians in history, a true artist who wrote and produced his own work rather than a manufactured product. That combination of massive commercial success and genuine artistic credibility is rare, and it is exactly what makes the fading of his memory so striking. Break. Behind the public image, George Michael was known to those close to him for an extraordinary generosity that he deliberately kept hidden during his lifetime. After his death, story after story emerged of quiet, anonymous charitable acts he had performed over the years, donations and kindnesses he had gone out of his way to keep secret from the public. He was said to have given enormous sums to charities and to have helped individual strangers in need without ever seeking credit or publicity for it. He reportedly tipped service workers with life-changing generosity and supported causes quietly, motivated by genuine compassion rather than any desire to burnish his image. These stories painted a portrait of a man far kinder than his celebrity persona suggested. The fact that so much of this only came to light after his death is itself telling. He could have used his charity to build a saintly public reputation, as many celebrities do, but he chose instead to keep it private, to do good without applause. That choice revealed a depth of character that adds enormous poignancy to his story. Behind the public image, he was not a perfect icon, but a real, complicated person who had navigated a complicated relationship with fame, with his own identity, and at times with his health, all under the relentless glare that came with being one of the most famous people in the world. Break. He died at his home on Christmas Day in 2016, and the timing made the news land with a particular weight. To die on Christmas, a day so associated with one of his own most famous songs, and with family and warmth, gave his death an almost unbearable poignancy. The cause was determined to be related to heart and other natural conditions. The news that he had died on Christmas Day stunned the world and added a final, bitter note to a year already defined by an extraordinary run of celebrity deaths. Coming at the very end of 2016, his death felt like the year delivering one last cruel blow. A fitting and terrible conclusion to 12 months of relentless loss. For fans, the association between his death and the holiday became permanent, a reminder every Christmas of the artist who died on that day. For the broader public, though, even this striking detail has faded into a vague recollection, rather than a vivid memory, in part because of the same crowding that affected Alan Rickman. George Michael died at the tail end of 2016, after a year so saturated with major losses that the public's capacity for grief had been stretched to its limit. His death became the final entry in the long, grim list that defined that year, and in becoming part of that list, it lost some of its individual force. Break. His musical legacy, of course, endures in a way that ensures he will never be truly forgotten as an artist. His songs remain staples of radio and streaming. His Christmas hit returns every holiday season, and new listeners continue to discover his catalog. But there is a crucial difference between remembering the music and remembering the man and his death. The songs play on, beloved and familiar, while the story of who he really was, the hidden generosity, the complex humanity, the circumstances of his Christmas Day death, fades into the background. With George Michael, the art is so dominant and so permanent that it almost obscures the person. Break. What makes George Michael's inclusion so powerful is the sheer scale of the gap between his fame and the fading of his story. He is one of the most successful musicians who ever lived. He died on one of the most memorable days of the year. And still the specifics of his life and death have slipped from the front of public memory. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. His story is the ultimate proof of this list's central idea. Forgetting is not about how famous you were, or how beloved, or how dramatic your death. It is about the relentless forward motion of culture which moves on from everyone eventually, even from a 100 million record-selling icon who died on Christmas Day. The next person on this list was also an icon, a film star of the highest order, and his death in 2025 came after a long and public battle with illness that had already changed the shape of his career. His story carries an arc of triumph, struggle, and a poignant late comeback that made his eventual death feel like the closing of an unusually rich and complicated life. He was one of the biggest movie stars of his era, the cocky rival, in a fighter pilot blockbuster and a brooding rock icon, and his death in 2025 closed a life marked by triumph, illness, and a moving late return. Val Kilmer died on April 1, 2025, at the age of 65, after years of battling the aftermath of throat cancer. He belongs on this list because, despite a recent and emotional comeback that briefly put him back in the spotlight, the full arc of his remarkable career has already begun to slip from the front of public memory. Kilmer fits the title in a complex way. He is not forgotten as a screen presence because his most famous films are perennial favorites, but the specific texture of his life, the brilliance and the difficulty, the illness and the comeback, and the death are exactly the kind of details that fade even as the iconic roles endure. People remember the characters far more vividly than they remember the man who played them. His story is one of the most layered on this list, a tale of enormous talent, a reputation for being difficult, a devastating illness that took his voice, and a final act of return that moved audiences before his death closed the book. It is a life with a genuine narrative arc, and that richness is what makes the fading of its details feel like such a loss. Break. Kilmer emerged as a star in the 1980s, quickly establishing himself as a charismatic and talented leading man. His breakout into the cultural stratosphere came with his role as Iceman in Top Gun, the cool, cocky rival pilot, whose rivalry and eventual respect for the hero became one of the most memorable dynamics. In a hugely popular film, that role made him a household name. He proved his range with a performance that many consider a career highlight, playing the rock icon Jim Morrison in The Doors, a transformation so complete that it stunned audiences and critics. He did not merely imitate Morrison, but seemed to become him, singing the songs himself. He went on to take on a string of major roles, including Batman in Batman Forever and parts in Heat. Tombstone and Willow, his turn as Doc Holliday in Tombstone in particular, became legendary among film fans, a performance of such style and wit that it is frequently cited as one of the great supporting turns in modern cinema. He was, at his peak, one of the most sought-after actors in the world. Break. Kilmer's career was also marked by a reputation for being difficult to work with, a label that followed him for years and that he sometimes acknowledged himself. Stories circulated about his intensity, his perfectionism, and his clashes on sets, and this reputation arguably affected the trajectory of his career. Kilmer himself framed his intensity as a commitment to his craft rather than mere difficulty. He was not a simple, beloved everyman, but a genuine artist with rough edges, someone whose talent was undeniable, but whose path was not always smooth, and that complexity is exactly what the simplified memory of him loses. Break. In the 2010s, Kilmer faced the battle that would define the final chapter of his life. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, and the treatment he underwent, while it addressed the disease, took a heavy toll, including a profound effect on his ability to speak. The actor whose voice had been part of his instrument found that voice altered forever. For a time, Kilmer was relatively private about the full extent of his illness, but eventually he spoke about it openly, addressing the cancer and its aftermath and the way it had changed his life and his work. The man who had played a singing rock god and a smooth-talking gunslinger now navigated the world with a voice that the illness had taken from him, a cruel turn for an actor. His openness about his struggle, when it came, was moving, and it reframed how the public saw him. The difficult, intense star became a figure of resilience, a man facing a devastating illness with a kind of grace and continuing to find ways to create and to connect despite everything that had been taken from him. The narrative around him shifted from difficulty to courage. Break. That resilience culminated in a remarkable late career moment that briefly returned him to the spotlight. He appeared in the long-awaited sequel to the film that had made him a star, reprising his iconic role in a way that accounted for his real-life condition. The scene he appeared in became one of the most emotional moments in the film, a real-life reunion layered over the fictional one. Audiences who watched it were deeply moved, aware that they were seeing a beloved actor return, despite a serious illness, his real struggle woven into the story. It was a comeback that transcended the film itself, a genuine cultural moment that reminded everyone of his enduring place in their hearts, and gave him a final triumph on the biggest possible stage. Technology was also used to help recreate his voice for certain projects, allowing him to continue performing in some capacity despite what the cancer had taken. These efforts spoke to both his determination to keep working, and the affection the industry and audiences still held for him. He was not done, even after everything, and that refusal to fade gave his final years a quiet heroism. His death in April of 2025 came after these final triumphs, and it was reported that he died from pneumonia, having previously recovered from the throat cancer that had so profoundly altered his life. The illness that ultimately took him was a complication of a body weakened by years of fighting, the long aftermath of his cancer battle finally catching up with him. The news of his death prompted an outpouring of tributes that recalled his iconic roles and his recent moving comeback. For a moment, the full scope of his career and his struggle was back in the public conversation. But as with everyone on this list, that moment of intense remembrance was destined to fade. His films remain as vivid as ever, and new viewers will continue to encounter Iceman and Doc Holliday and Jim Morrison, loving the characters without necessarily knowing the man's full story. The roles endure while the person recedes. What makes Kilmer such a fitting late entry is the completeness of his life's arc, and the way that even such a rich story fades. He had it all in narrative terms: the meteoric rise, the brilliant and varied performances, the difficult reputation, the devastating illness, the loss of his voice, and the moving comeback before the end. The richness of a life is no protection against the steady erosion of collective memory. The final person on this list, though, is different from everyone who came before, because her death is permanently bound to another death that happened the very next day. She was one of the most iconic figures in film history, beloved by generations, and the timing of her death, followed immediately by the death of someone she loved, created one of the most heartbreaking sequences of loss in the history of celebrity. And that is the revelation this entire list has been building toward. She was one of the most iconic figures in the history of film, a princess and a general to generations of fans, and her death was made almost unbearably tragic by what happened the very next day. Carrie Fisher died on December 27, 2016, at the age of 60, and the day after she died, her own mother died too. That sequence, a beloved daughter followed immediately by her famous mother, is the revelation this entire list has been building toward, and it makes Fisher the heartbreaking number one. Fisher fits the title in the most complicated way of anyone here. She is not forgotten as a character because her most famous role is woven into one of the biggest franchises in entertainment history. But the full story of who she was, her struggles, her brilliance as a writer, her honesty, and above all the devastating circumstances of her death and its connection to her mother's, has faded in a way that the iconic image never could. To understand why she is number one, you have to understand not just how she died, but how her death and her mother's became a single, inseparable tragedy. Carrie Fisher was, in a sense, born into Hollywood royalty. Her mother was a legendary actress and her father a famous singer, and she grew up amid the glamour and the dysfunction of mid-century celebrity. That upbringing gave her a clear-eyed perspective on fame that would later inform her sharp, funny, unsparing writing about the strange world she had been born into. She became a global icon with her role as Princess Leia in the Star Wars franchise, a part that made her one of the most recognizable people on the planet. Leia was not a passive princess but a fierce, commanding leader, and Fisher imbued the character with a wit and a strength that made her a hero to generations of fans. But Fisher was always far more than that single iconic role, and reducing her to Leia misses the depth of who she was. She was a gifted writer, a sharp wit, and one of the most honest voices in Hollywood about subjects that others kept hidden. Her talents extended well beyond acting into a body of written work that revealed an extraordinary mind behind the famous face. As a writer, Fisher produced work of genuine brilliance, most famously the semi-autobiographical novel that became a celebrated film, Postcards from the Edge. The book drew on her own life and her complicated relationship with her famous mother, and it established her as a serious writer, not merely a celebrity who dabbled. She also became one of the most prominent and candid voices on the subject of mental health, refusing to hide her struggles and instead turning them into material for her writing and her advocacy. This honesty made her beloved in a way that went beyond her fame as Leia. People connected with her courage in speaking truthfully about difficult things, her refusal to present a polished, false image of herself. In December of 2016, Fisher suffered a medical emergency while on a flight, going into cardiac distress during the journey. She was rushed to a hospital upon landing, and for several days her condition was the subject of intense public concern as fans around the world hoped for her recovery. The drama of those days, the uncertainty and the hope, gripped everyone who loved her. After several days in the hospital, she died on December 27, 2016, and the loss was felt around the world. Coming in the final week of a year, already defined by an extraordinary run of celebrity deaths, her passing added to the sense that 2016 had been uniquely cruel, taking yet another beloved figure just before the year ended. Fans mourned the loss of a hero, both the iconic Leia and the honest, funny, brilliant person she was in real life, and the tributes poured in from around the world. But the tragedy of her death was not yet complete, because the cruelest part was still to come. The day after Carrie Fisher died, her mother, the legendary actress Debbie Reynolds, died as well, on December 28, 2016. Reynolds, a Hollywood icon in her own right, passed away just one day after her daughter, in a sequence of loss so devastating that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. A mother and daughter, both beloved stars, gone within a single day of each other. The accounts that emerged painted a picture of a mother undone by the loss of her child. Reynolds had been with her family, grieving the death of her daughter when she suffered her own fatal medical event. It was widely understood that the overwhelming grief of losing Carrie had contributed to her mother's death, a heartbreak so profound that it took her life. This sequence transformed an already tragic death into one of the most heartbreaking stories in the history of celebrity. The bond between mother and daughter, complicated and deep, had been documented in Fisher's own writing, and now it ended with the two of them dying within a day of each other. The two were mourned together, their deaths inseparable in the public mind, and a joint memorial brought together fans grieving both women at once. For a time, it seemed impossible that anyone could ever forget such a story. And yet, true to the central truth of this entire list, even this most heartbreaking of sequences has faded for much of the public, remembered vividly only by those who hold it close. Fisher's legacy as a writer and a mental health advocate is a crucial part of why her loss matters beyond the iconic role and the tragic timing. Her advocacy helped change the conversation around mental health, and her courage in speaking openly about her struggles paved the way for greater honesty and less stigma. This dimension of her legacy is exactly the kind of thing that fades, while the iconic image endures. People remember Leia, the costume, the famous scenes, while the brilliant writer and brave advocate slips from the general memory, a fate she herself wrote about with characteristic wit and frustration. Like the other actors on this list, Fisher had completed work that was released after her death, including her continued role in the Star Wars franchise. Her posthumous appearances gave fans the bittersweet experience of seeing her one last time, the character living on briefly even after the actress was gone. These appearances are the clearest example of the strange immortality this list has returned to again and again. Fisher lives on screen, in a role she made iconic, even as the full human story of her life and her devastating death fades from much of the public. The character is eternal, replaying forever, while the person, with all her brilliance and pain, slips quietly toward the background. The reason Fisher is the perfect number one is that her story contains the deepest version of every theme this list has explored. She was as famous as anyone here, beloved across generations, and yet the full truth of who she was and how she died has faded. She struggled openly and bravely, like several others here, and she died in circumstances so tragic that they should have been unforgettable. And then there's the revelation that has anchored this entire countdown, the fact that her mother died the very next day, a sequence of loss so heartbreaking that it stands alone in the history of celebrity death.